Can you confirm that you can see everything?
Yes, we can see the whole slide.
Fantastic. So the lecture of today is dedicated to digital sovereignty and AI sovereignty, and these are topics I've been working on for the past 7 years almost, especially with regard to what the BRICS grouping is doing to build uh, digital sovereignty and to what extent countries have been successful or have failed. And what is very interesting for me in the research I do is to compare the various approaches of these leading emerging economies and understand what are the conditions of success or failure, and try to distill some lessons that could be useful for the others. It is actually what we have been doing with these two pieces of research. I'm sharing with my slides suggestions for further readings. These are the only two in Portuguese that I will share, but are the most recent that we have conducted. One is the dark blue that you see there with the Brazil in green on top of a stack of various semiconductors and other elements. There is a very large study that we have just published 2 months ago, consolidating the research that we have developed over the past years that I will present in the next slides. And this is quite interesting, and it will be published in English in the next semester, in case you do not read Portuguese, which I assume is the case for most of you. In this book, we understand and we analyze what are the dimensions of digital sovereignty, what are the risks that countries or corporations run when they are not digitally sovereign, what are the elements of what we call AI sovereignty, and what is this AI sovereignty framework that I will present towards the third part of this presentation, and then what are the path that Brazil could follow in order to build its own AI sovereignty. It is more or less the same type of approach that I have adopted in the other study that you see on the right, which is a work I've been doing for the Brazilian Ministry for Science and Technology, which has become now the policy of Brazil as regards digital sovereignty. So what we will see actually in a few slides, and it is something we have been dedicated a lot of research in this project that we run at the Center for Technology and Society. It's called CyberBRICS. is the only existing project dedicated to digital policies in the BRICS. And so what we have developed a quite thriving line of research on digital sovereignty, starting precisely from the assumption that this has become a very trendy, a very hype concept, but there is no universal definition of it, right? And so we have been trying to analyze the various dimensions of it and consolidate them into something that could be useful for policymakers, right? Before I enter into the details of the research, just let me tell you a couple of details of this project, because it could be useful and interesting also for you. On the one hand, for the research that you may use for your dissertations, all the research that we have produced over the past 8 years is in open access in this site, cyberbrics.info. And it is literally the only research project that not only the only one that analyzes digital policies in the BRICS, but the only one that does this with researchers from the BRICS countries. So every year we have a call for fellows, and selected fellows spend 3 to 10 or 12, in some cases, months in Rio with us. So I'm also sharing this because some of you, maybe in the future, when you're doing your PhD or after your master's, you might be thinking about applying for this, and good students are always very welcome. So what we have started with 8 years ago in the first phase of the project was to map cybersecurity in the BRICS. And then we have evolved with digital transformations in the BRICS, then AI governance in the BRICS, and now we are mapping digital public infrastructures in the BRICS. And parallel to these 4 phases, spontaneously, a path, an avenue of research dedicated to digital sovereignty has emerged since the final stage of this initial phase on dedicated to cybersecurity. Why? Because we have analyzed how BRICS countries define, regulate, and shape governance of cybersecurity. And analyzing this, we have understood already 6 years ago, and that was the conclusion of the book we published 6 years ago, the one that you see in front of you, that there is a sort of overlap between cybersecurity and digital sovereignty. Of course, they are not synonymous, but as cybersecurity is about analyzing digital systems to identify vulnerabilities, identify risks, mitigate them, ideally eliminate them, but that is very ambitious. The most effective outcome and the most desirable is already mitigating them. And that is a considerable part of digital sovereignty, which is about understanding systems, understanding the risks, mitigating them, but also not only technological risks, also geopolitical risks. And we will see this in some slides, the fact that geopolitically technological dependency have become something quite relevant, especially in the current volatile geopolitical environment. This adds a further layer of risks, both in terms of cybersecurity, but primarily in terms of digital sovereignty. And digital sovereignty is not only about understanding the risks, it's also about understanding the opportunities. What are the assets that you have as a corporation, as a country, as a community that you can leverage to build your own capacities, right? If you're particularly interested in cybersecurity, there are also these two books. The green one also will be published in English the next semester, that analyze cybersecurity in Brazil and connect it to digital sovereignty. I'm not losing too much time here because, again, these are very focused on Brazil, but are quite useful if you want to understand the connection between cybersecurity and digital sovereignty. Now, as I was mentioning, we have started to analyze digital sovereignty 6 years ago as a final step of the analysis on cybersecurity. And it was at that time that we started to map what digital sovereignty meant in leading emerging economies like the BRICS. And this book, that again, I'm showing a lot of reading suggestions. I'm not showing them to sell the books. I'm showing them they are all in open access just because they could be quite useful for your research, especially if you want to understand these dynamics of digital sovereignty. And so when we started to analyze the manifestation, the expression of digital sovereignty in the BRICS countries, we then consolidated our research in this book that was published 1.5 years ago and has been downloaded almost 40,000 times. I checked last week. And we understand very well that digital sovereignty means a lot of different things for different people. And that is why we have mapped what in practice mean in terms not only of policies and regulation, but of specific initiatives, right? And we know very well that there are different types and different expression of digital sovereignty. Some may be authoritarian or protectionist. Others leverage the creativity of the people, empower people through technology, promote competition. And so the first challenge was to define what is digital sovereignty. As these expressions and manifestations are very heterogeneous, so this is the working definition we came out with, the capacity to understand how digital technologies work, to develop alternatives and regulate them effectively. And this is instrumental to enjoy self-determination, power, control over digital assets, and not being controlled through technology that you do not understand, that is opaque to you, and that is supplied by foreign entities that are subject to foreign jurisdiction and foreign interest that may be even antithetic to your own national or corporate interests, right? Now, why this is quite particularly relevant for Brazil? Few people know, even in Brazil, that our own federal constitution is the only constitution in the world that includes technological autonomy as an explicit objective to be achieved. So differently, for instance, from our European friends that are building digital sovereignty on top of strategic autonomy, which is a concept very dear to our European friends, but it's an artificial concept. It's something that is not enshrined in a treaty or in a constitutional text, whereas in Brazil it is. It is something that the constitutional fathers and mothers, after the military dictatorship in 1988, when the constitution was adopted, included explicitly. Yes, you have to be patient and read until Article 219. But if you have the patience to reach Article 219, you see that you find an answer to your question: what is the constitutional basis of digital sovereignty in Brazil? And this is actually why Brazil, already 23 years ago, started experimenting with open software and open protocols to build technological autonomy. This is something that I explain very well in the conclusion of the books of the book that I mentioned before, Digital Sovereignty in the BRICS, and also in this paper that I published for the G20 presidency of India 3 years ago, to explain an example of failure and an example of success of how Brazil envisioned and exploited open source and open protocols to build digital sovereignty. So few people know that Brazil was the first country in the world in 2003, with the first Lula administration, to adopt open source as a state policy. So public administration had to adopt open source. Now, what has been the mistake of Brazil? To think that open source was only something to be adopted and not to be produced. This is very important. And we will see, I hope you will understand in a few slides, that digital sovereignty is not only about adopting a technology or adopting a law. It's about also being able to create alternatives. Because even if you have the best possible law, but you don't have an alternative to switch, it is useless to have a law if you cannot switch to an alternative that is compliant with the law. And even if you are adopting a top-notch technology, if you cannot switch to a different technology and you are locked in, then, well, you are not digitally sovereign. And that is a little bit the situation in which Brazil has found itself some years after having adopted this landmark policy of open source. Why? Because open source was adopted, but there was no investment in the development of open source. So after 10, 15 years, the proprietary alternatives became much more effective and performant. Also because the most expensive and important thing with open source is maintenance. If you don't invest in maintenance, in creation of open source, it becomes less performant, even if theoretically it's much better as it is transparent and everyone can build on top of it. Now, that was a little bit of a failure for Brazil. Differently, countries like India or China also in the early 2000s started to invest in open source, but they have invested in building open source technologies, not only in adopting them. And the result is that nowadays China exports open source models, and India exports digital public infrastructures, which is something that Brazil has lately learned from India. It's a lesson that Brazil has learned very well in this respect from India. So Brazil has developed and adopted since 2020 a landmark digital public infrastructure for payment, the PIX system, based on open protocols, exactly as India did a couple of years before. And the result, why this system that is now the most used digital payment system in Brazil, the PIX system, created by the Brazilian Central Bank, why it is a very good example of good digital sovereignty. Because before creating PIX, Brazilians were totally dependent on two foreign corporations for digital payments, Visa and MasterCard. Visa and MasterCard charged 3 to 5% per transaction, and were the only options. Now, with an alternative that is freely available to everyone, not only Brazilians have 3 to 5% of every transaction or every digital transaction in their pockets, which is already an enormous success, but on top of that, few people understand that what Visa and MasterCard earn is not necessarily the 3 to 5%, which is already a lot, is the enormous amount of data that they collect about every single individual and every single company that trade and buys using their systems. Visa and MasterCard are big data companies. They are big data companies. They are AI companies. Most of their earnings comes from the processing of personal data, of data about entire economic sector that they literally monopolize in most countries. Now, by creating a digital public infrastructure that redistributes this capacity to collect data, to process data, to extract value and create innovation out of this data at the national level, the PIX system, exactly as the Indian UPI system, has turbocharged the capacity of innovation and the competition of at the national level. So not only these digital public infrastructures have enormously lowered fees, they also redistributed the capacity to process data and create jobs, create innovation, pay taxes about data that are processed. And on top of that, it created a resilient system. So if, for example, tomorrow President Trump wakes up and is a little bit moody and decides to sanction Brazil because he doesn't like something that we do, and he cannot say as of tomorrow you cannot use Visa and Mastercard. He can say it, but we can keep on having digital payments. It is not like that in most countries in the world. So that is also very interesting in terms of resilience, right? Now, to just give you a little bit of idea, so PIX became over the past 5 years and a half the most utilized digital payment system. What is interesting is that this has not been achieved by blocking or outlawing Visa and MasterCard. That if you see in the chart on the right that has been published by The Economist last week, the Visa and MasterCard have not lost percentage or maybe slightly reduced combined percentage of their usage. What has been dramatically cut is cash or debit card or prepaid card. Pretty much no one, very few people use them, especially cash is very much unused nowadays in Brazil. So this has also been very good in terms of fiscal policies, because now it's much easier to track payments in Brazil than it was only 5 years ago. Now, why Brazil has developed this? Because it has looked at other leading emerging economies. And that is why I firmly believe that studying BRICS is something very useful from people, not only in the BRICS, but from all leading emerging economy or emerging economies, because it is much more interesting and useful to understand how other countries that have similar conditions and similar level of institutional maturity, economic development, industrial development, education, how they have faced similar challenges and produced solutions, rather than looking always at Europe or the US, thinking that the same kind of solution can be applicable in other radically different contexts. So that is exactly what Brazil has done. So Brazil has looked at India, that has built a unified payment interface some years before. Very few people know that actually India looked at Russia to develop its own interface, in its own DPI. Why so? Because when Russia first annexed Crimea in 2014, it was with the first invasion of Crimea before the full-scale invasion in 2022. It was immediately sanctioned with the prohibition to use Visa and MasterCard. So that was already used, weaponized, if you want, as a sanction already 12 years ago. The first example indeed was Russia. And so Russia had to develop this system. You see this card on the bottom of my screen called Mir, like the space station. In 2014, overnight, people were the entire population was totally cut out of digital payments. So overnight, this was developed, but this was a 20th century model based on a card. It was the great invention of the Indians was exactly to make it software only, to leverage their national asset, great engineering and informational data science skills, and make it software only. And the upgrade of the Brazilian central bank was to transform this into a public service. Right now, this leads us to understand a debate that I hope I will be able to convey today about the necessity to regulate not only through regulation. And this is very interesting. I work a lot on data governance, and if you look, for instance, on how countries like Brazil, India, or China have regulated personal data over past years, you see that normatively speaking, they all resemble themselves in terms of approaches, primarily because they all take huge inspiration from the European model, but then they embed their own idiosyncrasies, their own specificities. Brazil includes a multi-stakeholder approach to propose personal data policies. China combines regulation with industrial policy, so the promotion, the creation, the construction of technology, not only the regulation of it, but also the facilitation of the creation through industrial policy, which is a form of regulation. And India leverages in that the digital public infrastructures, the DPIs software, to translate normative obligations into software tools. There is another very interesting digital public infrastructure that is very understudied, and I study in this article in other publication, the DEPA, the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture, which is a consent manager, so allows to manage consent to data collection through software. So what we see here by studying how BRICS approach certain types of digital technologies regulation is that we can regulate going beyond regulation. Actually, this is something that our authors like Lawrence Lessig were already writing about 30 years ago almost. In 98, he was already speaking about code as a form of regulation and the markets. If you have studied cyber law, you for sure you will know Lawrence Lessig's work. And so my point here is to understand that law is essential but not sufficient, and we have to understand what are the key enablers. This term will come back in a couple of slides of digital technologies to be able to understand how they function and develop them and regulate them. And how do we do this? But not only by adopting law, that again is essential, but also together with the law, leveraging industrial policy to support research and development, to understand how the technology work and develop alternatives and scale them up, right? If you're interested in all the debate about DPIs and how they can be leveraged, including for to regulate to some extent digital technologies and how they support AI, I suggest you check these two papers elaborated by my colleagues that are both in open access on the CyberBRICS.info. There is another two papers they wanted also to suggest by my colleague Wayne Wang about how the approach of China to data governance and how China has leading has been leading this understanding. I would say the practical understanding of data as a factor of production. So we hear since at least 20 years, actually exactly 20 years, that data is the new oil, but very few countries have put this mantra in practice. China in 2019, well, already in 2015, actually, with the big data strategy, started understanding data as a factor of production together with capital, labor, and land. And then this became national state policy in 2019. So China has developed its own regulation based on the consideration that data information is an asset, and so you have to consider it as an asset, protected of course, but also leveraged it. And this kind of consideration is what led us a couple of years ago to start working on data sovereignty, which is, as we will see in a couple of minutes, the core pillar of AI sovereignty, right? But data sovereignty, and that is something I published about also very recently, should not be considered as a synonymous of data autarky. Digital sovereignty is not synonymous of digital isolationism. Data sovereignty is not synonym of data localization or data autarky. It is part of it, if you want, the localization of data, but it's not only about the localization, and also localization by itself is useless. Data sovereignty is about informational self-determination. Those who have studied data protection have understood and already studied this principle, which is the core of personal data protection since 40 years. Now, what is interesting, and we explain this in this paper, to understand how some of the BRICS countries look at data protection, is that there is a conception of informational self-determination not only from an individual perspective, which is what lead us to have data protection, rights for the data subject, blah, 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 but also from a collective perspective. That is what leads countries like China to think that information is a factor of production, to think that not only the individual has the right to understand who is collecting the data, with whom they are shared, and for what purposes, but also corporations, countries have the right to understand who is collecting data, who is taking advantage and extracting value out of data, who is paying taxes out of this value, and for which purposes are they utilized, including for which surveillance and spying intelligence purposes they are utilized, right? Again, being sovereign does not mean being separated, isolated. That is also something that we have discussed for the past years in the work on legal interoperability in data governance. We started debating this 3 years ago. Well, actually more. We published first 3 years ago, and we extensively analyzed this in this book that was published at the beginning of 2026 on personal data architectures in the BRICS countries, also with a chapter co-authored by Professor Cesar Nail, one of your professors. And this has also inspired, to some extent, digital policy making in the BRICS. We have periodic meetings with our colleagues at the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that frequently ask us for advice, including in the various research that we develop, because it is quite unusual to have this kind of research that I'm sharing with you, and it's very useful for BRICS policymakers, as gives them a good photography of what is happening in the BRICS. So after we have started advocating for legal interoperability in the BRICS in our research, this was integrated officially by the BRICS declaration in 2024, the Kazan Declaration, that has for the first time called for the development of a global framework for data governance led by the BRICS to ensure interoperability of data policy at the BRICS level and beyond. If you want to have a little bit more details about this, could be done in practice through both contractual provisions that we also annex in the conclusion of the book as example, or through administrative or treaty strategies. You can read the conclusion of this book, and then here we come to the last chapter of the presentation of today. What is AI sovereignty and why it is relevant for us, right? Now, based on the definition I shared before, the working definition that we have used over the past years, simply paraphrasing it, we can understand that AI sovereignty can be understood as the capacity to understand, develop, and regulate AI systems, thus retaining self-determination, agency, and control over such system. And this is the definition we have been using. I presented this in this paper on what are the key AI sovereignty enablers that could be used as a framework. So this case framework made of at least 8, but over the past years we have expanded a little bit. Enablers, fundamental enablers of AI sovereignty is what has driven the research we have developed over the past years. Again, in these publications are all in open access. You might not be able to read the one in Portuguese, but the other two basically are the same book that was first launched as in a preliminary version at the Internet Governance Forum of the United Nations in 2023, and then updated and published by Springer at the end of last year, but a preprint is available on cyberbrics.info. Now, why this idea of trying to decompose AI in multiple elements, enablers, and understand what these enablers, why they are relevant, they are essential actually, and why they all need to be looked at. Out of frustration, if I can be very frank, as in 2023 when I first drafted this, most of my colleagues were very much concentrated in debates about risk-based regulation, which is again essential, but it is not sufficient if you want to be sovereign. You see at the bottom of this stack, of this layered structure, risk-based frameworks, so what is called AI safety, is essential, but it's only one of the enablers that we should look at if we want to have any chances of building AI sovereignty, right? And so, in particularly, regulation is only part of the strategy. We have to regulate, but we also have to develop, to have industrial policy, and to have a multi-stakeholder governance that allows to connect the developers, the regulators, the academics, in order to try to create a synergy in how we shape each of these enablers. Right? What are they? Well, data, of course, is quite evident. If you don't have data, you don't train AI models. But you have to regulate how you can train it to avoid also massive illegalities, such as the current way in which we train AI in total violation of copyright law or data protection law. Then software and algorithms and models. This is quite, again, evident. Especially, I think we had a couple of weeks ago a very good example of why investing in having models or using open models is quite relevant. I'm pretty sure you have read in the news, I think 3 weeks ago, the Trump administration decided, almost one month ago actually, the Trump administration decided to bar the usage of the frontier models developed by Anthropic, Fable, and Mythos. So basically, cutting out of the capacity to identify vulnerabilities. Most of the world, or pretty much all the non-US scientists and corporations in the world. Computational capacity, that is quite essential. Pretty much everyone out of China is dependent on three corporations. If you do AI, which are AWS, so Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. They have 70% of markets in terms of cloud computing. So we literally all depend on them, and they all depend on one corporation, NVIDIA. And NVIDIA depend on one corporation that is very much unknown, but is the only corporation that produces 95% of semiconductors in the world, TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, which is the main reason why pretty much everyone is so interested in what happens in Taiwan, because 95% of high performance semiconductors are produced there. Meaningful connectivity is quite essential to have people using and sharing AI. I will get back to this in 2 minutes to conclude my presentation. Electrical power and natural resources. When I wrote about this 3 years ago, pretty much no one was understanding why I was speaking about electricity. I think nowadays it's pretty obvious. Not only electricity, but also mineral resources. Why this is essential to build AI and to let it function. Actually, this is why Brazil has an enormous advantage compared with others. Brazil has abundant energy, which is clean energy. 85% of our energy matrix is renewable due to 40 years of industrial policy in hydroelectric, solar, and so on, and wind power. What I call humanware, which is digital literacy and research. If you do not have a digitally literate population, you have a population of consumers, not of producers and developers. And if you do not invest in research, it's very hard to develop, obviously, frontier AI, but I would say also any type of AI if you don't have appropriate research ecosystem. Cybersecurity, well, I think that it's quite self-evident. If you do not embed AI security from the very conception of the AI, you basically build a time bomb. And last, but of course not least, risk-based framework, AI safety, what we have been discussing for years, and what all the pieces of legislation like the AI Act are all about, which is essential, absolutely important. But it's a huge mistake, in my view, to only focus on this, because there are other essential elements that, without having proper focus, make it quite useless to focus only on AI safety. Now, a quick reality check on Brazil to let you understand why connecting all these dots is quite relevant. So Brazil has adopted 2 years ago a plan for AI that was presented by President Lula as a landmark plan at the G20 under the Brazilian presidency, which is a collection of very good initiatives. But I think there are some interesting and important vulnerabilities in it. Digital sovereignty, it is mentioned there, but only as regards the development of models based on Brazilian data and Portuguese language data, which is not necessarily the only thing that is important here. I was mentioning before the importance of meaningful connectivity. So this is what meaningful connectivity looks like in Brazil. 78% of the population does not have it. And that is a very important misunderstanding of connectivity at the global level, and particularly in the global south. In most developing countries, and I'm pretty sure it's the same thing here in South Africa, the people do not have access to the full internet, to open internet connectivity. They have access primarily to zero-rated apps, typically all the social media of the Meta family of apps and few others that are subsidized, whereas all the rest, yes, is accessible, but a very high cost with a limited data cap that you easily and quickly consume, and then you are stuck into only the zero-rated apps. And that is why AI for 78% of Brazilians looks like this. It's only Meta AI. Why so? Because with a very sneaky and effective strategy over the past 10 years, Meta has subsidized its own services around the globe, especially in the global south and in countries that do not have strong net neutrality regulations. What does it mean? It created a direct line to the consumer that daily trains its own AI that has been automatically installed in its own in all its services with his or her data. And not only the consumer trains exclusively the meta AI, but also himself or herself trained to think that that is the only AI. And that is why in Brazil, the only way to compete for other AI labs has been to themselves sponsor access, zero-rated access to their own services. So Perplexity has signed a deal with Vivo. OpenAI has signed a deal with Claro. There are two of the three main sorry operators to zero rate their services. Why? Because they have understood that without it, it is impossible to compete with Meta, right? Now, again, looking at how do we solve this? We don't have to look at Switzerland, Estonia, or Norway. It's sufficient to look at India, our fellow BRICS country that in 2016 has decided to prohibit zero rating. And what has been the result of this, that at the time was hailed as a great net neutrality victory? It was, but as I mentioned in our book on digital sovereignty, this is the greatest untold story of digital sovereignty. Because by prohibiting zero rating in India, the Indian government it's called TRAI, the telecom regulator, has created a level playing field where national startups, Indian startups, could be accessible by anyone at very low cost and scale up given the huge Indian population that was going to be massively connected. And now India has enormous digital champions that have been created in the past 8 years. These are some even a little bit outdated data to give you an idea of the magnitude of this. The connected population in India has more than tripled over the past 8 years. The price of the gigabyte has decreased by 95%, and the consumption has increased 20-fold. So that is a little bit of what I wanted to share with you, hoping that this has been useful, and hoping that you have understood that being with you here today is a pleasure for me. It's not an obligation, and it's a pleasure because I think that fostering this type of intellectual cooperation, capacity building, sharing of information, of research between people that work and dedicate time to research in emerging economies is a fundamental step to find solutions that can be useful and effective to solve problems. So I hope this has been useful, and of course I'm very happy to receive questions if you have any.